Hi everybody, welcome to Paris and welcome to another episode here. The truth is the city is very much in bloom during the springtime period, and part of me wants to show you endless episodes of gardens and parks and flowers, but I thought in the interest of variety we'd change it up a little bit here and partake in some good old-fashioned art appreciation inside this very overlooked church of the Latin Quarter known as Nicolas du Chardonnet. So why the name of Nicolas du Chardonnet? Well, Nicolas simply comes from good old Saint Nicholas. And Chardonnay comes from the fact that this area in the Middle Ages was completely rural and completely covered with thistles everywhere. And the word in French for thistle is chardon. They were actually planted and cultivated in this area because the chardon, or thistles, were a very useful tool when it came to combing and cleaning wool to prepare it for making fabrics and clothing and whatnot. What we see today of the church is mostly 17th century Baroque in style, and it replaced a previous medieval church that stood here for hundreds of years. It was designed by a very talented man indeed, who we'll talk about inside. He's actually buried inside with a big beautiful tomb in one of the chapels, and we'll get into that as well. But the man who designed this church is definitely a well-known artist from the 17th century. They added a bell tower that you can see here in 1625, but there wasn't quite enough room for the facade on this side of the church. So the facade didn't arrive until some 3 centuries later, 300 years to finally complete the building. And even by the early 20th century, this entrance didn't exist. For example, I'm gonna pull up a couple of images for you. This one is a photo from at least 100 years ago that shows clearly the facade next to the bell tower had not yet arrived in the early 1900s. And then here's a painting by Maurice Utrillo, and you can see that he painted this very scene in the early 1900s, and the facade had not yet arrived. So we'll talk a little bit more about when the facade finally was completed. Now, as we make our way toward the doorway here, the French Revolution gutted the interior, which was very common, sadly, during that period in Paris. And they also planned to demolish it, the revolutionaries, but the church was granted a reprieve due to an existing lease on the property. That was really the only reason they didn't tear it down eventually. By the time that lease was up, the revolutionary dust had settled, and the church was given back to the clergy. Before we make our way inside, though, I'd be remiss if I didn't show you this, one of my favorite views of the 5th arrondissement, and this corner cafe with the shrubbery. I just love this view from every angle. So there's a little sidewalk cafe at the end there called the Café Saint-Victor, and my goodness, when you talk about dreamy sidewalk cafe experiences and watching the world go by, I just love this view. In fact, I'd maybe prefer to have my coffee here looking back at the cafe itself. But either way is good. Okay, so let's make our way into the church itself. One quick note, because it's particularly quiet inside this church and people are often praying inside, I'm not going to talk on camera. Instead, I'll record a voiceover after the fact. So if you notice that the audio changes at all, that is why. So let's do a deep dive into Saint Nicolas du Chardonnet. Here we go. I know some of you like to joke I have a knack for finding music when I walk into churches. Today was no exception, as someone was practicing the organ, but it didn't last long, but still a very nice way to enter a building like this. Here in the nave we've got some classic components of the Baroque style, a powerful sense of order, pleasing proportions, elegant, if not slightly understated ornamentation. This church was largely designed by Charles Lebrun, who was famous for being the court painter of King Louis XIV. King Louis described Lebrun as, quote, the greatest French artist of all time. And because of that reputation, Lebrun was chosen by the Sun King to decorate the interiors of Versailles. He also would do work at the Louvre, the Château de Vaux-Vicomte. He even went on to create several art schools and academies. Mr. Lebrun lived nearby, so this was his local parish, And in fact, the artist and members of his family are buried here, and we'll see that chapel later on with their tombs. Turning our attention to the grand organ, the main structure, the console itself, is from 1725, and the instrument was moved here from a different church over at Les Halles in the 1st arrondissement. The church was being prepared for demolition, but they couldn't bring themselves to demolish this beauty, so they transferred it over here. Okay, onward. Because this church is very much linked to the artist Lebrun, one of his early masterpieces was transferred here. And it's just as you walk in to the church on the right-hand side. It's from 1642, and it's called The Martyrdom of St. John the Evangelist. It's considered one of the great masterpieces of his youth. Lebrun was just 23 years old when he painted this. And it really helped to secure his reputation at the time as a new young phenom among the French artists of the 17th century. St. John was a popular character among artists because he was the patron saint of sculptors, which Lebrun's father happened to be, so perhaps this is a subtle nod to his dad. The story is that St. John was placed in boiling oil as part of his execution by the Roman Emperor Domitian, who we see here on the horse. But St. John was not harmed by the oil, in fact seemed rejuvenated by it and started preaching Christianity, they say, from within the cauldron. Now, before the 17th century, this scene was usually portrayed with St. John already in the cauldron in a rather static pose, but that wasn't visually dramatic enough for the Baroque period. So instead, Lebrun shows us the moment where John's being hoisted up toward the cauldron, looking up at the cherubs from heaven as the emperor points angrily at the fire, demanding it to be stoked hotter and hotter. This adds more drama and emotion and compositional movement as well. And let me just remind you, he's 23 years old when he paints this. And then right next to it, as is often the case, as you enter these churches, we've got a baptismal font. And this one's particularly lovely. It's got a brass fixture atop a base of red marble. You find quite a bit of red marble in this church in particular. It was a material that they use extensively for the construction. As we zoom in here a bit, what's interesting is to see this little keyhole, and you can imagine you could open up this fixture here and it would splay out via these two hinges on either side, almost like big brass wings to allow you access to the font. And then just steps from that previous masterpiece, we've got a beautiful picture from Corot. This is the Baptism of Christ from 1845. And here we go from John the Evangelist to John the Baptist with Christ by the river. Corot was known for his idyllic country landscapes, capturing these poetic moods reminiscent of the Renaissance backgrounds of, say, Leonardo or Raphael. And often in Corot paintings, you'll see the setting itself and nature taking a center stage in a way, and you can see that's the case here. Almost 2/3 of the composition is dedicated to setting the scene. But Corot was one of those big-time artists you'll see hanging in the major museums of the world, so to just have one of his originals hanging out here in this chapel is pretty special stuff. In keeping with the painting theme, we've got a couple more from the 17th century. These aren't from a particular artist, they're just labeled as the French school, so they could have been used as studies or portfolio pieces of students. This one I quite like. It's got that sort of dreamy sepia tone to it, almost reminiscent of a Rembrandt painting. This chapel has some 18th century pieces that were given to the church after the French Revolution as a sort of restitution for all of the beautiful treasures that were stolen from it. And then below we've got a nice statue of Saint Anne with a child. And on top of the altar here in this chapel, I'll show you here, is quite charming. I think that you see her name embroidered here with some roses. Here we've got what they call the Wall of the September Martyrs, because during the Revolution, countless numbers of priests and clergy members were imprisoned. And here's a list of some of the key names from this parish in particular. And during the September massacres of 1792, the angry revolutionaries stormed the prisons, pulled out the priests, and demanded that they renounce their Christianity. And if they didn't, they were immediately executed, often in very heinous ways. So here is a particular portrait of a man who happened to be the head priest of this very church, Saint Nicolas du Chardonnet. And you can see he perished in 1792 simply because he refused to renounce Christ. So those are known as the September Martyrs. Some lovely candelabras here. And again, another embroidered inscription. And here we've made it to the transept. Normally behind these curtains it would open up into a beautiful chapel called the Communion Chapel. It happens to be closed off right now, perhaps due to restoration of some of the paintings inside. Fortunately, when I was here a few years ago, I snapped a few shots of the chapel, so I can pull those up and give you an idea of what's behind the curtain. a fantastic bit of light coming through here. Wow. Stunning. So we're at the choir now in the altar. First thing I want to show you is this lovely metallic staff of sorts. It must have a technical religious name, but it's quite a work of art in its own right, and it just sits here attached to the railing for whenever it needs to be used. What also catches the eye is this beautiful, I want to call it a Bible shelf, which I know is stupid, but that's all that comes to mind. But look at this fantastic detail. In old descriptions of the church, you see the chandeliers here mentioned quite often too of the choir. They were considered to be one of the more spectacular decorative elements. We can see a lot of colored marble on the altar, particularly that red marble I referenced earlier. 2 beautiful wooden statues of angels that are gilded here in gold. Again, more chandelier and crystal garlands and things of that sort. I read that in the 1600s, when the archbishop came to consecrate the altar, he did so, but refused to consecrate the rest of the church, simply because that front facade that we talked about earlier hadn't arrived yet. It would be almost 300 years later when in 1937 the church officially got its facade and was officially consecrated. Here along the front railing we've got some very unique ornamentation that I believe represents the thistles that we talked about earlier. And if we look closely, I can imagine there was perhaps crystal, is my guess. Little thistles that were attached to the end of these stems that were likely destroyed or removed during the French Revolution. But very interesting to see that the symbolism of the thistle was very much a part of this church's story. Here's a striking funerary monument to a man named Bignon. He was a state councilor and a big-time benefactor of this church, and he put a lot of money forth towards the construction of this building, but sadly passed away before it was completed. So it was his sons who requested that he be buried here in one of the chapels in honor of this great benefactor of a church that he never got to see during his lifetime. And here a great ceremonial chandelier of sorts. And you can see where they would have placed the candles there for certain ceremonies. And here's our good old Saint Nick. And the artistry in this church, hopefully you've picked up on it by now, is this extraordinary. Almost every single chapel has something going on. It really is a veritable museum and so often overlooked. As in many churches, we've got a dedication here to Le Sacré-Cœur, or the Sacred Heart of Christ. Here at his feet, we've got some of the instruments of the Passion, or the objects used during the crucifixion, the nails, the crown of thorns, even the whips, I believe, they're tucked away in the back. And here I get to share with you one of my favorites. This is the Chapel of the Holy Virgin. It's the axial chapel right behind the altar, and it's what left the biggest impression on me the first time I visited this church. So I will clam up and let you have a moment. This plaque commemorates the first electric lighting that was added to the chapel, and it must have been quite a technological marvel. And it mentions, quote, the dawn of a new era. Here we see Saint Michel stomping down on the devil, but in a much more polite way than we usually see. Also in this chapel, what appears to be a beautiful bishop's throne. And if you're not already aware of this fun fact, a bishop's seat was known as a cathedra, which is where the word cathedral comes from. Flanking either side of this chapel are the marble plaques of messages of thanks known as ex votos. And you can see, because of the proximity of the prayer candles here, they've installed some sheet metal to protect the wood paneling, which I can only assume is a good idea. But yeah, this is a chapel you don't want to miss, tucked away behind the altar here at Saint Nicolas. And just a few steps to the left is the chapel dedicated to Mr. Lebrun, court painter of King Louis XIV and of the Palace of Versailles, and designer of this church for the most part. Now, sadly, this tomb sits against this bright sunny window, so it's backlit most of the day. But if you know where to look, there is a handy little light switch that helps a lot. Being that this was his local parish church, Lebrun purchased this chapel for a great sum of money and designed it himself to house the tombs of he and his wife and also his mother. Included in the purchase price was an assurance by the church that occasional mass would be held here in perpetuity, but who knows if that's still happening 3 centuries later. Now, excuse me as I pause the video here, because as I'm doing the voiceover, I realized that I completely missed something while I was filming, and that's the fact that the revolutionaries clearly scratched out several words of this inscription on the tomb. Obviously, the references to Louis XIV, and perhaps the word royal or royal court, and it was all too common for them to remove bits of text like that. In fact, I'll show you on the exterior of this church something similar. The mausoleum was sculpted by another famous artist by the name of Coisevaux. And he was a fine sculptor of, again, the Palace of Versailles. Many of his sculptures have been transferred over to the Louvre. He was also responsible for sculpting the gorgeous tomb of Colbert over at the Church of Saint-Eustache. So it's really remarkable that you've got the tomb of one of the most famous French painters here in Lebrun, and his mausoleum is sculpted by one of the great court sculptors. And here's the tomb of Lebrun's mother, designed by him. And she is very lovingly depicted here on the day of the Last Judgment, rising up and looking toward heaven. And there's the angel with the trumpet sound. And it's really quite remarkable because you can sense the love and admiration that Lebrun had for his mom. And it certainly it comes through here. I'm really struck here by the complex emotion on her face. I get a sense of awe, gratitude, relief. It's pretty striking. There are a couple of other works done by Lebrun for this chapel. This one is a painting of St. Charles Borromeo, kneeling in prayer. He also painted the ceiling here of the angel Gabriel. So we're really spoiled just under one roof to have so many works of this master of the 17th century, and in King Louis's words, the greatest French artist of all time. Changing up the medium a bit here, we've got a carved relief in wood of St. Peter and his keys. We're on the other side of the transept now, and we've got another appearance by St. Nicholas. few more notable objects on our way out. This statue of Saint Vincent de Paul, always seen with children. If you look closer, there's a baby's leg in his arms there. He's swaddling a child, which is pretty much what we always see Vincent doing. And then right at the end, we've got another beautiful representation of Christ's baptism. It was done in 1758. It's by a French painter named Restou. We see God from above overlooking the scene of John the Baptist, and he's pouring just a few droplets of water onto Christ's head here. Just a superbly executed painting here from the 18th century. And facing it is a lovely little portrait, a lovely big portrait of St. Catherine. Now that I think of it, this church has quite the compendium of saints across the board. And on our way out, we'll come across one of the most famous by far. We've got St. Joan of Arc looking particularly armored and battle ready. And it's just occurring to me, I wonder if she's often placed at the entrances of churches because she's meant to protect them, in case the English come around invading again. So that'll do it for the interiors of Saint Nicolas du Chardonnet. Hope you enjoyed that. I mean, who needs an art museum when you've got buildings like this kicking around? It's fantastic. We're not quite done yet. I've got a few exterior details to show you as we get blasted into the real world again. On certain days, this railing you see around the right-hand side of the screen, there's a gentleman who sells used books of all different sorts at very cheap prices, and he lays them out along that balustrade there. It's pretty charming. Here we're at the base of that bell tower I showed you at the start. 1625 is the date of this. And speaking of revolutionary fervor and damage left behind, you can see this plaque. They took their chisels and tick, 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 and removed any reference to the king, the nobility, or any of those royal institutions. And that leads us to the west-facing facade, which for most of the church's life was the main entrance. And this was designed by, you guessed it, Mr. Lebrun, who at this point is just showing off, honestly. Didn't hurt that Lebrun had a very good friend who was a sculptor named Legendre, who did the sculptures here. And I guess it helps to have a talented friend when you design an ornate doorway. You know you have someone who can pull it off. And for those of you who have been kind enough to stick it out to the end here, I'll throw in a personal anecdote that is rather near and dear to my heart, and I think about it every single time I pass by this church. Years ago, when my wife and I were still dating and we were nursing a very long-distance relationship between Paris and New York, I would pop over to Paris periodically to spend time with her, And boy, it always felt way too short. And I remember the end of one of my visits, it was the very last day. I was alone in the Latin Quarter. I knew that in a few hours my flight was going to take me back home. I had no guarantee if I was going to ever see that girl again, if I was ever going to see Paris again. And there was so much uncertainty. But I said to myself, I don't have the time, but I'm not ready to say goodbye to Paris. Let me just go around one more corner and just enjoy one more street. And I remember that it was specifically this building that I came across, turning around that one last corner. And I'll never forget that. It was over a decade ago, but this church in the back of this building will always represent to me that feeling of the uncertainty of never knowing if I was going to return to Paris. But now when I get to stand here and I get to look at it, even with the trucks going by, boy, am I grateful that it turned out okay. And I, in fact, can come whenever I want and enjoy these views. And I don't have to leave. I have so much gratitude for that. Thanks for watching, and Patreon supporters, you can join me live right now for a cafe chat. Take care.